The Jews of Spain and Portugal. Exiled, abandoned, and sold into slavery. The history of the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal is marked by hardship, persecution, and forced conversions that shaped the lives of many for centuries. The era between the 14th and 17th centuries saw Jews subjected to brutal measures, including expulsion, forced conversion, and enslavement. Through papal bulls and royal edicts, these communities were torn apart, abandoned to foreign lands and subjected to the scourge of slavery. John Ogilby, Alan Godbey, and Frederick David Makata have all addressed these themes in their historical writings, documenting the exile of the Jews from Iberia, their subsequent abandonment in West Africa, and the horrific fate that befell many of them as they were sold into slavery. The Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. The Jewish presence in Spain and Portugal dates back over 1,000 years. By the late medieval period, Jews had integrated into Iberian society in various roles, including merchants, scholars, and diplomats. However, with the rise of religious intolerance and the centralization of power, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, the situation for Jews rapidly deteriorated. In Spain, the late 14th century saw a surge in anti-Semitic sentiments, particularly after the Black Death, during which Jews were scapegoated and accused of poisoning wells. The Christian population became increasingly suspicious and hostile toward Jews, leading to numerous pogroms and forced conversions. The climax of this persecution came in 1492, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain. They were given a choice: either convert to Christianity or leave the country. This expulsion was enforced under the auspices of the Spanish Inquisition, a religious tribunal that sought to root out heretical Jewish converts to Christianity, known as conversos, whom the authorities viewed with suspicion. The expulsion from Spain was devastating for the Jewish community. It is estimated that over 100,000 Jews were forced to leave, many of whom sought refuge in Portugal. However, Portugal's acceptance of the Jewish refugees was short-lived. In 1497, King Manuel I of Portugal, under pressure from Ferdinand and Isabella, ordered the expulsion of Jews from his kingdom. However, the edict was not immediately enforced. Instead, Jewish children were forcibly baptized, and families were either converted or expelled. For those who remained, the prospect of conversion or exile became a grim reality. The papal bulls and royal edicts. Both the papacy and Iberian monarchies played crucial roles in shaping the fate of the Jews during this period. Pope Sixtus IV, in particular, issued several papal bulls that sanctioned the expulsion and conversion policies. One of the most significant was the bull Execrabilis in 1462, which condemned the Jews and their religious practices. This papal decree set the tone for the persecution that would follow, offering religious and moral justification for the policies of exclusion and forced conversion. Papal authority played a major role in the justification of forced conversions and the persecution of conversos. The role of the Catholic Church in these events cannot be overstated. It was a powerful ally of the monarchy, providing spiritual legitimacy for the measures against the Jews. These papal bulls paved the way for the formal establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella. The Inquisition targeted those who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, often with catastrophic consequences for entire families. The edicts, especially the expulsion orders of 1492 and 1497, were part of a larger European strategy to homogenize Christian societies. The Iberian Peninsula, in particular, became a focal point of religious orthodoxy. Jews and Muslims, who had long been integral parts of Iberian culture, were now viewed as threats to the Christian purity of the nation. The forced conversion and the fate of the conversos. Many Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity, or who chose to do so in order to avoid expulsion, found themselves living in a precarious situation. These conversos, or new Christians, were caught between two worlds. They were expected to embrace Christianity, yet they faced suspicion from both their Christian neighbors and from the Inquisition, which frequently targeted them for alleged insincerity in their conversions. While some conversos managed to assimilate into Christian society, many were caught in the crossfire of the Inquisition. The inquisitors used harsh methods, including torture, to extract confessions of heresy. Those who were found guilty were often burned at the stake or otherwise executed, while their families were disinherited and ostracized. The plight of the conversos led to an internal diaspora within the Iberian Jewish community. Many conversos, despite being baptized, secretly continued to practice Judaism. The Inquisition, which kept a watchful eye on the converts, drove many to flee Spain and Portugal, sometimes seeking refuge in distant lands like the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, or even the Americas. For the Jews in West Africa and the slave trade, the Jews of Spain and Portugal, who were unable to escape to safer regions, found themselves in a dire situation. While some were able to make their way to North Africa or the Ottoman Empire, others were left with no other option but to turn to the Atlantic coast, where they would be caught up in the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade. John Ogilvie, in his 1671 work, America, described the displacement of the Jews from Iberia and their subsequent abandonment in West Africa. Ogilvie details the fate of Jewish refugees who, after fleeing the persecution in Spain and Portugal, found themselves in the coastal regions of West Africa. The Portuguese were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and many of these Jews were sold into slavery, either as captives themselves or as intermediaries facilitating the trade. The slave markets in places like the Canary Islands, Madeira, and Cape Verde became common destinations for Jews fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. Alan Godbey, in his writings, provides further insight into the Jewish diaspora and the role of the Portuguese in the sale of Jewish captives. According to Godbey, many of the Jewish refugees, after being abandoned by the Portuguese in West Africa, were sold into slavery and transported to the Americas. The slave trade, which involved a complex network of European, African, and New World economies, also implicated the Jewish refugees who, in some cases, were involved in the commerce of enslaved Africans. Frederick David Mokata, in his historical studies, explores the impact of the Inquisition on Jewish life in Spain and Portugal, noting the tragic fate of those who were caught in the web of slavery. Mokata writes about the cruel irony of the Jewish refugees being sold into slavery by their supposed Christian neighbors, illustrating the deep contradictions in the treatment of Jews during this period. The legacy of Jewish persecution. The tragic history of the Jews in Spain and Portugal in the late medieval and early modern periods represents one of the darkest chapters in European history. The papal bulls and royal edicts that mandated their expulsion, conversion, and persecution shattered the Jewish communities in Iberia, driving them to the fringes of the known world. The abandonment of these refugees in West Africa and their subsequent sale into slavery highlights the cruel and tragic consequences of religious intolerance. The suffering endured by these Jewish refugees left deep scars on the global Jewish diaspora, and the impact of their experiences continued to resonate for generations. The memory of forced conversions, exile, and slavery haunted the descendants of the Sephardic Jews, many of whom eventually found their way to the Americas, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere, creating vibrant communities that kept the memory of their Iberian ancestors alive. In sum, the exile of the Jews from Spain and Portugal through papal bulls and royal edicts, and their subsequent abandonment in West Africa and sale into slavery, marks a period of unparalleled suffering and loss. The authors John Ogilvie, Alan Godbey, and Frederick David Mokata have contributed valuable historical perspectives on this tragedy, shedding light on the horrific fate of those who were victims of religious intolerance and the transatlantic slave trade. Negroland in the 1700s, a historical exploration of West Africa on old maps. Negroland, a term once used to describe a part of West Africa, appeared on European maps throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Its usage was primarily in reference to the region that stretched across the western part of the African continent, from the Sahara Desert in the north to the Gulf of Guinea in the south, and from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the area of Lake Chad in the east. The name Negroland is now considered outdated and problematic, as it was based on European perceptions of race and geography. However, understanding the term's historical usage provides valuable insights into European colonial attitudes, the transatlantic slave trade, and the geographical knowledge, or lack thereof, of Africa at the time. This essay explores the historical context, the significance of the term Negroland, its representation on maps of the 1700s, and its implications for the understanding of West Africa during this period. The origins of the term Negroland. The term Negroland emerged during the early modern period, a time when European exploration of Africa was in its nascent stages. The term is believed to have derived from the Latin word Niger, meaning black, which was used to describe the inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European explorers, traders, and cartographers, most notably the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English, began to map the African continent with increasing detail, though their understanding of the interior remained limited and often imprecise. For Europeans, the term Negroland referred broadly to the regions of Africa south of the Sahara Desert that were inhabited by Black Africans. The geographic boundaries of Negroland were vague and varied depending on the source, but it generally encompassed much of the western part of the continent. It was often used interchangeably with terms like the Guinea Coast or the Slave Coast, which referred to the areas along the Gulf of Guinea from which enslaved Africans were taken during the transatlantic slave trade. Wanchurak, Negroland. On maps of the 1700s. During the 1700s, European cartography was still evolving, and many parts of Africa remained largely unknown to Europeans. The maps of the time often reflected European notions of race, empire, and geography rather than accurate depictions of the African continent. The term Negroland appeared prominently on many European maps of West Africa, though its exact location and boundaries varied between mapmakers. One of the most influential early maps that included the term was the 1650 map by the Dutch cartographer Willem Bleu. This map, which was based on the limited information available to Europeans at the time, depicted a large swath of the African interior labeled Negroland running along the northern border of the Gulf of Guinea. Later maps in the 18th century continued to feature Negroland, but with increasing inaccuracies and ambiguity. For example, the famous 1730 map by the French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville also showed a region called Negroland, but it was not drawn with any consistent spatial accuracy, and its boundaries were often ill-defined. In some maps, Negroland extended further east toward the Niger River, while in others it included portions of modern-day Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Despite the inaccuracy, these maps played a significant role in shaping European ideas about Africa during the 18th century. The maps were often the result of colonial interests, as they were used to establish territorial claims and to organize the slave trade. The vast unknowns in the interior of Africa led to a great deal of speculation, and the use of terms like Negroland reflected a European tendency to categorize and simplify what was seen as an exotic foreign land. The transatlantic slave trade and its connection to Negroland. The geographical area known as Negroland was closely associated with the transatlantic slave trade, a central feature of European involvement in Africa during the 17th and 18th centuries. The demand for enslaved Africans in the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, South America, and the southern United States, created an insatiable demand for human labor, which led to the establishment of slave trading posts along the African coast. The region referred to as Negroland, with its proximity to the Gulf of Guinea, became a significant source of enslaved people. European traders established fortified trading posts along the coast, from which enslaved Africans were taken and shipped across the Atlantic. These slave trading hubs, such as those in modern-day Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, were often depicted on maps as key points of entry into the region known as Negroland. The role of Negroland in the context of the transatlantic slave trade is crucial to understanding why this term was so prevalent in European maps. For the Europeans, Negroland represented not only an area of commercial interest, but also an ideological construction of race and human difference. The enslaved Africans taken from this region were considered racially inferior by Europeans, and the categorization of the land as Negroland reflected these racist assumptions. First, the racial implications of the term. The term Negroland carries deep racial and colonial implications, rooted in the European system of racial hierarchy that emerged during the early modern period. For much of the 18th century, European thinkers and policymakers regarded Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, as a land of savagery and backwardness, populated by people they viewed as racially distinct and inferior. This racial construct was used to justify the exploitation and enslavement of Africans. By labeling vast swaths of Africa as Negroland, Europeans were asserting their own perceived superiority over the people who lived there. The word Negro itself was associated with the idea of a racially subordinate group. Negroland, as depicted on maps, became a representation not of a specific geographic region, but rather of a racialized space, one that was understood as being populated by people who were seen as inherently different from Europeans. The mapping of Negroland, therefore, was not simply about geography, but was also deeply entangled with the racial ideologies of the time. The term served to reinforce the notion that Africans were a homogeneous group, even though the reality of African societies in the 18th century was far more complex and diverse. The rapid decline of the term and the evolution of African cartography. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the use of the term Negroland began to fade as European cartographers gained a deeper understanding of the African continent. Exploration of Africa, particularly the interior regions, was becoming more extensive. Explorers like Mungo Park, who famously navigated the Niger River in the late 18th century, contributed valuable new geographic knowledge that challenged the simplistic and often erroneous representations of Africa on maps. With the expansion of European imperialism and colonization throughout the 19th century, the vague and racially charged term Negroland was replaced by more specific terms referring to individual regions and countries. The evolving cartographic knowledge of Africa led to a more nuanced understanding of its geography and its people. Although these developments were still often shaped by imperialist and racial motivations. Despite the eventual decline of the term Negroland, its legacy remains a powerful reminder of the way race and geography were intertwined in European thinking. The mapping of Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries was not an objective exercise in cartography, but rather a reflection of colonial power dynamics and racial ideologies. Conclusion. Negroland, as depicted on maps of the 1700s, offers a window into the European mindset of the time, one that was shaped by ignorance, racial prejudice, and colonial ambition. The term itself, while a geographical marker, was also a tool for racial categorization and justified the exploitation and dehumanization of African peoples through the transatlantic slave trade. The vague and shifting boundaries of Negroland on these maps illustrate how little was known about Africa, but also how knowledge was often filtered through colonial and racial lenses. Today, the term Negroland is rightly viewed as an outdated and offensive relic of a past that sought to reduce a rich, diverse continent to a simplistic and racialized category. However, understanding its historical usage provides valuable context for the history of European colonialism, the slave trade, and the evolving field of African cartography. It is essential to study these historical concepts not only to comprehend the past, but also to recognize the enduring impact of colonial attitudes on contemporary representations of Africa. The Door of No Return in the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a biblical reflection on Deuteronomy 28:15-68. The transatlantic slave trade remains one of the most harrowing and impactful events in human history, with the forced displacement of millions of Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas. Central to the painful narrative of the transatlantic slave trade is the Door of No Return, a physical and symbolic entry point through which countless Africans passed on their way to bondage in the Americas. This essay seeks to explore the significance of the Door of No Return, the experiences of the enslaved Africans, and how these events correlate with the biblical text of Deuteronomy 28:15-68, a passage often interpreted as a prophetic description of the suffering and humiliation of the African diaspora. The Door of No Return, a symbol of slavery's brutality. The Door of No Return is the name given to the doorway on the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, one of the infamous slave forts on the West African coast. These forts were used by European slave traders to hold Africans before they were sold into slavery and shipped across the Atlantic. The name Door of No Return is derived from the tragic fact that once an individual passed through that door, they would never return to their homeland, marking the beginning of an excruciating journey that would end in the Americas. For many, it was the last glimpse of Africa they would ever have. Cape Coast Castle and other similar forts along the West African coast, like Elmina Castle, are haunting reminders of the Atlantic slave trade's vast scale. These castles were constructed by European colonists to serve as hubs in the larger trade network, where human beings were commodified and sold as property. The enslaved were often held in cramped, dark dungeons, suffering from diseases, abuse, and malnutrition. The passage through the Door of No Return signified the tragic reality of their fate: separation from their families, their culture, and their heritage. For the millions of Africans who were captured and transported through these forts, their identities and human dignity were stripped away. They were no longer viewed as individuals with agency and heritage, but were reduced to mere cargo, forcibly removed from their native lands, and condemned to lives of unimaginable hardship in the Americas. For many, the Door of No Return was more than a physical threshold. It represented the loss of everything familiar and a painful separation from their ancestors and home. The transatlantic slave trade and the African experience. The transatlantic slave trade, which spanned from the 16th century to the 19th century, forcibly displaced an estimated 12 million Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas. This journey was not only physically grueling, but also emotionally and psychologically devastating. Enslaved Africans endured horrific conditions on the slave ships, with many dying from disease, malnutrition, or abuse before reaching their destination. The survivors were then sold into slavery and forced to work under brutal conditions on plantations, in mines, and in households. The trauma of the slave trade was not merely a product of the physical suffering, but also of the destruction of African cultures, languages, and familial structures. The survivors were often stripped of their identities and forced to adopt the language, religion, and customs of their captors. Families were torn apart as men, women, and children were separated, and entire communities were displaced. The cultural and emotional scars of the transatlantic slave trade continue to affect the descendants of enslaved Africans today. The legacy of the trade can be seen in the social, economic, and political challenges faced by African-descended communities around the world. However, it is also evident in the resilience and perseverance of those who, despite the unimaginable hardships of their ancestors, have managed to preserve elements of their cultural heritage and identity. To ensure, Deuteronomy 28:15-68, a prophetic reflection. Deuteronomy 28:15-68 is a passage from the Hebrew Bible that contains a series of curses pronounced upon the Israelites if they fail to obey the commandments of God. In this passage, the Israelites are warned that disobedience will lead to a range of calamities, including defeat by enemies, destruction of their land, exile, and enslavement. The imagery described in these verses is strikingly similar to the experiences of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent condition of the African diaspora. The passage opens in Deuteronomy 28:15 with a declaration that, "If you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you." The curses described in the following verses detail a bleak future for the disobedient Israelites. One of the most notable and tragic curses in the passage is found in verses 68. "The Lord will bring you back in ships to Egypt, on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you." Deuteronomy 28:68 NIV. This verse is often cited as a powerful reflection of the African experience during the transatlantic slave trade. The reference to being brought back in ships to Egypt can be seen as a symbolic representation of the forced transportation of Africans across the seas, back to a state of enslavement and humiliation. Egypt, in biblical terms, often symbolizes a place of bondage and oppression, making it a fitting metaphor for the forced transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The subsequent phrase, "There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves," underscores the commodification of human beings, a central theme in the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were not just seen as human beings, but as property to be bought and sold in the marketplace, with no regard for their dignity or humanity. The final line, "But no one will buy you," points to the utter degradation of the enslaved individuals, suggesting that despite their forced labor and suffering, they were still treated as expendable and undesirable by the system that profited from their enslavement. Correlation between Deuteronomy 28:15 to 68 and the transatlantic slave trade. The connection between Deuteronomy 28:15 to 68 and the transatlantic slave trade is clear when we consider the historical and prophetic implications of the passage. The vivid imagery of exile, displacement, and enslavement described in the text mirrors the experiences of millions of Africans who were forcibly removed from their homes and subjected to horrific conditions in the Americas. The curse of being brought back in ships to Egypt symbolizes the forced transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, while the idea of being sold into slavery and exploited for labor reflects the harsh realities of the plantation system in the Americas. Many African Americans, scholars, and religious leaders have drawn a parallel between the curses described in Deuteronomy 28:15 through 68 and the experiences of enslaved Africans. They see the passage as a prophetic foretelling of the suffering that would be endured by Africans as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. The idea that the descendants of Israel could be subjected to such suffering for their disobedience resonates with the belief that the African diaspora's suffering, which continues to this day, is part of a larger divine narrative of punishment, survival, and eventual redemption. At the same time, some African American religious thinkers and theologians have used the passage as a means of finding hope and strength in the face of adversity. The narrative of the Israelites' suffering in Deuteronomy 28 is not only a story of punishment, but also one of eventual restoration. For many, this offers a message of perseverance and faith, as they believe that the suffering of their ancestors will eventually lead to redemption, healing, and a return to spiritual and cultural wholeness. Fricker's conclusion. The door of no return stands as a powerful symbol of the pain and suffering endured by millions of Africans who were forcibly displaced through the transatlantic slave trade. It represents the beginning of a journey that separated people from their homes, cultures, and identities, and subjected them to unimaginable hardships. In this context, the biblical passage from Deuteronomy 28:15 to 68 offers a poignant reflection on the African experience. The curses described in the passage, displacement, enslavement, and exploitation, echo the realities faced by Africans during the transatlantic slave trade and the legacy of oppression that followed. However, the passage also offers a sense of hope, suggesting that suffering may lead to eventual restoration. The story of the African diaspora is one of unimaginable pain, but it is also one of resilience, survival, and cultural endurance. Through the historical and biblical lens, the experiences of the enslaved Africans can be understood as part of a larger narrative of human suffering and the quest for redemption, reminding us of the need to confront the past while striving for a more just and compassionate future.